October 27, 1962. The bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. A Soviet nuclear submarine designated B-59 has been underwater for days. The crew has had no radio contact with Moscow for so long they do not know whether World War III has already started. The submarine is being depth-charged by American naval forces above them. The explosions are getting closer. The heat inside the submarine has reached 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Carbon dioxide levels are rising. Men are passing out at their stations. The captain has made his decision. He believes the war has started. He believes his submarine is under attack. He has the authority. He has the weapon. He orders the launch of the nuclear torpedo. Under Soviet protocol, a nuclear launch requires the agreement of 3 senior officers. The political officer agrees. The captain agrees. The third officer, a man named Vasili Arkhipov, looks at his captain and says no, one word. In a submarine at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean with depth charges exploding above them and a crew that believed World War III had already started. Vasili Arkhipov said no, and the world did not end. To understand what Vasili Arkhipov was facing at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, you first have to understand what was happening above the surface in October 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. In October 1962, American reconnaissance aircraft discovered that the Soviet Union was installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, 90 miles from the coast of Florida. President Kennedy demanded their removal. Soviet Premier Khrushchev refused. For 13 days, the 2 most powerful nations on Earth stood at the edge of nuclear war. American naval forces imposed a blockade around Cuba. Soviet ships were heading toward that blockade carrying more military equipment. The world held its breath. Most people know the Cuban Missile Crisis as a story about Kennedy and Khrushchev, about diplomats in rooms making careful, calculated decisions. What most people do not know is that while those diplomats were talking, the most dangerous moment of the entire crisis was happening at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, in a submarine that had no idea what was going on. Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov was born on January 30, 1926, in a small village outside Moscow. He grew up in the Soviet Union during the most turbulent decades of its history. The Stalin years, the purges, the terror, World War II, the Cold War beginning. He joined the Soviet Navy and proved himself a competent and capable officer. He was not a rebel. He was not a dissenter. He was a loyal Soviet naval officer who believed in his country and his service. But he had one experience before the Cuban Missile Crisis that may have shaped what he did in that submarine on October 27, 1962. In 1961, just a year before the crisis, Arkhipov had been on another nuclear submarine, the K-19. The K-19 suffered a catastrophic reactor coolant failure. It came within minutes of a nuclear meltdown that would have been catastrophic. Arkhipov watched as crew members were exposed to lethal radiation trying to repair the reactor. He watched men die slowly from radiation poisoning in the weeks that followed. He understood better than almost any other Soviet naval officer what nuclear weapons and nuclear accidents actually meant in human terms. He had seen it, and that understanding may have been exactly why he was able to say no when everyone else was saying yes. In October 1962, 4 Soviet submarines were secretly dispatched to the waters around Cuba. Each submarine carried nuclear torpedoes. Each nuclear torpedo had a yield equivalent to the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The submarines were sent to support Soviet operations around Cuba and to be available if the crisis escalated to war. Submarine B-59 was commanded by Captain Valentin Savitsky. Arkhipov was on board as the flotilla commander, the senior officer across all 4 submarines, which was why his agreement was required for a nuclear launch. The submarines had orders to surface and contact Moscow if they needed to use their nuclear weapons. But communication was nearly impossible at depth, and surfacing risked detection and attack. B-59 had been underwater for weeks. The crew was exhausted. The heat was unbearable. The air was becoming toxic. And then the American Navy found them. What the crew of B-59 did not know was that the American Navy was not trying to destroy them. They were using practice depth charges, specially designated signaling charges that were smaller than combat depth charges, to force the submarine to surface so they could identify it. The Americans had published internationally that they would use these signaling charges and that submarines should surface in response. The message never reached B-59. So when the depth charges began exploding around their submarine, the crew had no way of knowing they were not under actual attack. To the men inside B-59, it felt exactly like combat. The explosions got closer. The submarine shook violently. Instruments failed. The temperature climbed to 140 degrees Fahrenheit in some compartments. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion. Carbon dioxide levels reached dangerous levels. Captain Savitsky had been awake for days. He had no communication with Moscow. He had no way of knowing whether the crisis had escalated to war. He made the only assessment his exhausted mind could make from the information available to him inside that submarine. The war had started, and he was under attack, and he had a nuclear torpedo. Captain Savitsky's exact words when he ordered the nuclear torpedo launch have been recorded by surviving crew members. He said, "We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not become the shame of the fleet." The political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, agreed with the launch. 2 of the 3 required officers had said yes. Everything now depended on Vasili Arkhipov. Arkhipov did not panic, he did not shout. He did not make an emotional argument. He made a rational one. He told Savitsky that the depth charges were not combat charges, that their pattern and size suggested they were signaling charges designed to force them to surface rather than destroy them. He told Savitsky that without communication with Moscow, they had no way of knowing whether war had actually started. He told Savitsky that launching a nuclear torpedo based on incomplete information in a situation they did not fully understand would be an act they could not take back. He told Savitsky they should surface, make contact, get information, then decide. Savitsky was furious. The argument went on. Finally, Savitsky agreed. B-59 surfaced. No nuclear torpedo was launched. The Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved diplomatically in the days that followed. The world did not end. Because Vasili Arkhipov made a rational argument to an exhausted, furious captain in a boiling submarine at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. And the captain listened. Military historians and nuclear war analysts have studied what would have happened if Arkhipov had said yes. The conclusions are sobering. A single nuclear torpedo launched from B-59 would have destroyed the American naval vessels above it. The United States would have interpreted this as a Soviet nuclear first strike. American nuclear forces were already at DEFCON 2, the highest state of readiness short of actual nuclear war. A Soviet nuclear strike on American naval vessels during the Cuban Missile Crisis would almost certainly have triggered an immediate American nuclear response. The Soviet Union would have responded to that. Nuclear war. The estimated death toll from a full nuclear exchange between America and the Soviet Union in 1962 has been calculated at between 100 million and 500 million people in the initial strikes alone. Billions more from the nuclear winter that followed. The end of human civilization as it existed at that point. All of it sitting on the word of one man in a submarine at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Who said no? While B-59 was surfacing in the Atlantic Ocean, the Cuban Missile Crisis was reaching its most dangerous point above the surface as well. On October 27, 1962, the same day Arkhipov said no in the submarine, an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. The pilot was killed. American military commanders were urging Kennedy to launch immediate airstrikes on Cuba. Kennedy refused. He chose diplomacy. In the days that followed, Kennedy and Khrushchev reached an agreement. The Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba. The United States would quietly remove its missiles from Turkey and pledge not to invade Cuba. The crisis was over. October 27, 1962 is now known by historians as Black Saturday, the day the Cuban Missile Crisis came closest to becoming nuclear war. On that single day, 2 separate men made 2 separate decisions that prevented nuclear war. Kennedy chose diplomacy over military force above the surface. Arkhipov said no to a nuclear torpedo launch below it. Either decision alone might not have been enough. Together they saved the world. Vasili Arkhipov returned to the Soviet Union after the Cuban Missile Crisis and continued his naval career. He was not celebrated. He was not recognized. The events on B-59 were classified. For decades, nobody outside a very small circle of Soviet naval officers knew what had happened in that submarine on October 27, 1962. Arkhipov was promoted over the years. He eventually reached the rank of vice admiral. He retired from the Soviet Navy in 1985. He lived quietly with his wife Olga in Zhelezno outside Moscow. He never spoke publicly about what had happened on B-59, not because he was forbidden to, but because it was simply not in his character to seek attention for what he had done. His wife Olga later said that he told her about it only once, quietly, almost in passing. He said, "I said no. And that was that. That was that." The man who saved the world said no and then went home and got on with his life. He died on August 19, 1998. The world he had saved did not know his name. 21 years after Vasili Arkhipov said no in a submarine at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, another Soviet officer faced a similar choice. On September 26, 1983, Stanislav Petrov was sitting in a nuclear early warning bunker outside Moscow when his system showed that America had launched 5 nuclear missiles at the Soviet Union. His job was to report it. He decided it was a false alarm. He said no, and the world did not end. 2 ordinary Soviet men, 2 moments when the world came to the edge of nuclear war, 2 decisions to say no when everything around them was saying yes. Neither of them was a general or a president or a politician. Arkhipov was a naval officer on a boiling submarine at the bottom of the ocean. Petrov was a duty officer on a night shift in a bunker. The most powerful nuclear weapons in history were controlled by the most powerful governments on Earth. And twice the thing that prevented their use was an ordinary man deciding that no was the right answer. There is something in that fact that should stay with you. Here is the power play and twisted truth at the heart of Vasili Arkhipov's story. The most powerful military machines in human history spent decades building weapons capable of ending civilization. They spent billions on missiles and submarines and bombers and command systems and protocols designed to ensure that if nuclear war started, the response would be immediate and overwhelming. They built systems designed to remove human hesitation from the equation. And twice those systems were defeated not by technology or diplomacy or military strategy, but by ordinary men who hesitated, who said no, who decided that the information available to them was not sufficient to end the world. The power play is this. The most powerful governments on Earth built weapons that could destroy everything. The twisted truth is this. Those weapons were stopped not by other weapons. They were stopped by a word. No said by a Soviet naval officer at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, on a boiling submarine, while depth charges exploded above him, and his captain was ordering him to launch. Vasili Arkhipov died on August 19, 1998. He was 72 years old. The world he had saved did not know his name. It was not until 2002, 4 years after his death, that the story of what happened on B-59 was declassified and made public at a conference in Havana, Cuba, attended by former American and Soviet officials. Thomas Blanton, the director of the National Security Archive, said something at that conference that has never left me. He said, "A guy called Vasili Arkhipov saved the world." That is all he said. A guy called Vasili Arkhipov saved the world. Not a president, not a general, not a diplomat. A guy. History's Wildside is about power plays and twisted truths. And here is the final thing I want to leave you with after this episode. You have now heard the stories of 2 ordinary Soviet officers, Arkhipov and Petrov, who said no to nuclear war. You have heard about Desmond Doss, who went to war without a gun. About Irina Sendler, who smuggled children in toolboxes. About Oskar Schindler, who spent his fortune on a list. About Gavrilo Princip, who changed the world with a wrong turn. None of these people were extraordinary when they were born. They became extraordinary in a single moment. When they made a single decision. History is not made by the powerful alone. It is made by ordinary people in extraordinary moments. And sometimes, just sometimes, the most powerful word in history is the simplest one. No. Subscribe to History's Wildside for a new story every Sunday. Power plays, twisted truths, and the ordinary people who changed everything. This has been History's Wildside. I will see you next Sunday.